I wanted to have Dr. Bridge Bombay. Of course, he's a regular on this show, normally comes on Wednesdays. Did not come on Wednesday. We were talking about the protests and things at hand. I wanted to get him back on. Dr. Bombay, of course, is possibly the most prominent cardiologist in town. He's the founder of Centric Health, very important medical group in town with a range of services and doctors at their disposal. Dr. Bombay, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Pleasure to be here, Richard. How are you?
I'm doing terrific. Dr. Bombay, I didn't want this week to get past us before I ask you, it's a common refrain you'll hear in America where we've been on lockdown and worried about shaking anybody's hand or getting within 6 feet of somebody. And after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which triggered so many riots, not only across the country, but across the world, huge gatherings of people violating every social distancing protocol that we've worked so hard for. I was curious what you think what effect that might have on triggering yet more outbreaks and a potential second wave.
So, Richard, more than likely, those events will seed a large number of new infections. And as we know from the behavior of the virus, that it's going to take us 2, 3, 4 weeks before we have a understanding of the extent of infections. So infections per se, I would say we don't need to worry about, because most of the participants in the crowds are younger people and likely will have less virulent display of the symptoms and the virus. However, there are certain qualifiers. One, there were a lot of people in close proximity, and some of them wore masks, others didn't. Two, people tend to be loud and boisterous in those settings, and when you're loud and boisterous, the amount of inoculum increases, and we have talked about the dose, which is extremely relevant in those situations. Third, a lot of times when the police takes a preventative action like pepper spray or tear gas, it has a corrosive impact on the airways, lungs, and it exposes the person to possibly a more virulent form of infection. So the fact that it occurred in outdoors is a favorable event. The fact that they were crowded, close enough, boisterous, and there was a possible deleterious impact of tear gas and other things, it could lead to more virulent form of infections. So under normal circumstances, I would say that spread of infection in younger people builds the herd immunity, is a net positive. Here, the numbers in general and the extenuating factors may create another cluster or clusters of infection.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. I was just curious. I know you don't like to get political, but when the president held his photo op at the church, which had burned a few days before, and the attorney general had ordered the dispersal of the crowd across from the White House, and tear gas and other means were used. And that seems to me, while on the one hand the president's trying to contain the virus, but as you said, this because of its effect on the lungs could have the opposite effect. What did you think when the president did that?
So there are a couple. Let me try to see if I can segment the question into different silos.
Okay.
The one is purely speaking from a institution of democracy. The institution of democracy has a component of boisterous cacophony. In my mind, that is the symphony of democracy. So it's necessary for people to express their opinion in unintimidated form. And if the protests are nonviolent, that's a plus thing. That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. Because in life, I've never seen an injustice be remedied by silence. You have to speak out, and you have to be loud in your demands. Otherwise, it all falls on deaf ears. So to me, it's important that people are given the right, not the right to vandalize and loot, but the right to protest and speak their minds. So having that part of the question answered, the second part is, was the force necessary? You know, you have heard from a lot of people, you have heard even current Minister of the Secretary of Defense, previous Secretary of Defense, you have heard from a lot of the Army people who took exception to the events that unfolded. So, again, I'm not privy to the inside workings of the details, but it seems to me we should encourage people to speak out against injustices as long as the decorum is maintained, as long as there isn't damage done to people or property. Now, I also understand that it doesn't matter why the crowds gather. When the crowds gather, it gives certain criminal elements to use that as a cover to do their nefarious things. And that happens in celebrations, when Pan Ams are won, it happens in Boston, it happens in Chicago, it happens in Detroit. So those things happen when the large crowds gather. So it's painful to see nonviolent protests being dispersed, and it's painful to see people taking some nefarious elements taking advantage of people's protests and inflicting damage on property, looting and vandalizing. That's not condonable.
How much does your background as an immigrant and coming to this country with the freedoms we have and appreciating them as I know you do, when you see that the troops were sicked on an otherwise peaceful demonstration before the curfew was done. From your unique perspective as a person who came to this country, who's built a wildly successful business, and as a man who's reached a stature of a great respect in town, how does that resonate with you when you know that these people, you just said that this country was born, that we can't fix problems without having a voice, that silence is not the way to go. That's exactly what the people across from the White House were doing, and were moved, and tear gas was used on them to move them out of the way for basically a photo opportunity. How does that resonate with you?
So again, I'm going to try to segment it into silos. One, you asked me about my experience as an immigrant. Mm-hmm. I have to start off by saying that the notion Americana is the most powerful and empowering notion in the world. It's timeless, it's priceless, it's a force of good. And it's an incredible virtue that this nation has spread across the world for liberty at an individual level and at national level. So it's a beautiful thing to have a notion of Americana. But the paradox I've seen here is that this land of opportunity doesn't have the equal access to all the citizens to that notion Americana. And that was a bit of a challenge for me to understand, because when I would have conversation with my kids, they would roll their eyes. I apparently was tone deaf. I thought they were politically correct, but they thought I was tone deaf. So when I started in a small village, Richard, there were no material means, but I was given enough material to have means. And the material I was given was ambition, education, direction. Those were the tools that more than amply justified the absence of material in my growing up period. And it always takes a village to raise a child. So what I'm seeing here when I said that there is no equal access of opportunity, when we see people, blacks and Hispanics who are in poor quarters, the access to school or the quality of school isn't as good. The emphasis on education is not as emphatic. The other threats, the safety, the drugs, the violence, there are a lot of things that are naturally deterrent towards education. At the end of the day, education is the greatest equalizer. Now, going to the second part, in 1975, when I was in high school in India, our Prime Minister at the time, Indira Gandhi, declared a state of emergency, which was authoritarian rule for 2 years. And they put all the political people in jail. All the civil rights were taken away. And she paid heavily for that, and she was defeated in the next election. So the coerced conformity and submissive silence are the tools of autocracy. These are not the best practices that U.S. has practiced and exported. And we need to go back to our roots. We are the moral authority. We are the moral authority, and we need to defend our moral authority. We need to send a message of democracy, of individual empowerment. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. I mean, you're talking about coerced conformity, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but these seem to be some criticisms of the Trump administration. And I guess I would ask you, we live in a really conservative area here. I know you know that. You appreciate that. And I don't know whatever your personal politics are. But when we have these frank discussions, and I had this question to black businessmen yesterday who were talking about the Black Lives Movement. And my question was, when you speak honestly and you're critical of the status quo, do you worry about that your own business could suffer, that your own reputation could suffer when you don't kind of toe the line to toe a more conservative line?
I worry about the pre-existing conditions that are debilitating in our country. And the pre-existing conditions are division and polarization. And no matter what a person says, it falls in pre-existing boxes. And that's a sad situation. We can't win the world with half the nation. We have to get together. I think every effort we do, every word we utter, has to be in the direction of bridging that chasm. So if you are respectful and honest, it should be taken as a respectful and honest contribution. We all need to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. We can't denigrate our citizens. We can't say loose words that exacerbate the wounds and not heal the wounds. So yes, as I said, sometimes you have to speak out, but with respect, with empathy towards other people's viewpoints, which may be contrary to your viewpoints. Not in an insulting manner, but in a respectful, empathetic manner to move the ball forward.
You know, Dr. Baum, we're talking to Dr. Bridgebaum. Dr. Baum, you've been a regular on this show, of which I'm so grateful, because your voice, particularly on the coronavirus, is so important as we all try to navigate our way through here. And you have often told me, you said, Richard, I'm not political. You're telling me things and opening your heart here in a way that you haven't before. What is it about what's going on with the protests and the government's handling of it, or what you've seen, that beg you to maybe have a louder voice in the political arena where you didn't before?
I wouldn't say a louder voice. I would say I feel it's my duty as a citizen to share my experiences and be part of the solution. And the solution demands we integrate our people in the society. We open access to opportunities so they can be they can achieve their potential. So, when I look at different things, let's say when I look at incarceration, we have 1% of the population nearly in jail, and we spend $80 billion. What is our ROI on that? Does it decrease recidivism? Would rehabilitation work better? Would education, starting from the early years, be a better investment than expanding prisons? I think we need to look at society as a whole, and if everybody has a stake in the eventual outcome, this is not a zero-sum game. A rising tide will lift all the boats. Mm-hmm. I think we need to re-engineer social structure in a way that allows every child a stake in the society.
What do you think of the calls to defund the police, or at least, if not that radical, to strip away from the police a lot of their traditional, for example, if you have a domestic dispute, you wouldn't send a police officer there. You would spend somebody who specializes in almost like a counselor. If you had a call on somebody who is being destructive and possibly mental ill, you would send a mental health counselor instead of training a police officer to do that. Do you think that that we are using our police department in the proper ways, or is it time to look at some of their interactions with the public and say we need more trained people in those specific disciplines?
So it's easy to be an armchair analyst. When police officers are engaged in potentially dangerous and tense situations, decisions are made in a split second. And the concern or the fear that the other person may have overpowering a gun or other material is real. So a lot of times, bad decisions get made with good intentions. So I think to ascribe every bad outcome to a malicious decision is incorrect and simplistic. Also, a lot of those situations where cops are involved that are successfully de-escalated, they never make it to the news cycle. So I think when we are in this mentality of police against the protesters, it's probably a simplistic way of looking at things. So regarding the other situations where police can be used more discriminately, I'm not the judge on that, but I guess if we could be more refined in the use of police, that would be fine with me. But if you send a counselor to a domestic violence case, I won't feel comfortable. I would like a cop there to make sure that some dangerous husband isn't beating up on his fragile wife. So at least at the very beginning, I like a police officer, but eventually, yeah.
Right. I got it. Okay, we are out of time. Dr. Bombi, anything you want to add before we wrap it up here?
I think this topic of racism is such an inflammatory topic, and I approach it with trepidation and a degree of anticipation, because we need to learn, we need to educate ourselves, we need to bring both our ears to the conversation. This invisible barrier needs to be broken. This elephant in the room needs to be attended to. We need to be able to talk to each other. I think the tone deafness is dumb, and so is political correctness to a degree. We need to have empathy, kindness, honest, candor with each other.
Perfect. That's it. Dr. Bridgebomby. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you joining the show again, and I hope we'll talk to you next week, sir.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, very good. That's Dr. Bridgebomby.